Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Story of a Storyteller. And my guest is Aaron Denius. How are you, Aaron?
Doing great. I am really excited for this.
Good, 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 cool. So Aaron is the author of Genesis, a science fiction novel that you're going to hear a lot more about. He also has experience writing on television, which is one of the things I'd love to kind of find out more about because that's just something seems so foreign to me and everything. But like everyone always has a really interesting start in life, and you're no different, of course. So I read on your website that during your childhood, you spent time between Venezuela and the US. So
Yes.
My very, very early childhood, I would have been doing the same, but between the US and Ireland, as I was born in New York. So in what way do you think splitting time between two completely different countries changed or affected you or made you who you are?
That's actually a great question. I was born in the States. I was born in Virginia in kind of a small town there while my parents were in college. And my father's side of the family is from Venezuela. So they always came to the States. His father came to the States for college to go into agricultural engineering. And it was interesting going back and forth because I would spend most of the school year in South America, where ironically going through the private school system there, it was a much faster track than in the US. So the education came a lot faster. They just taught stuff very well, but it was a very privileged life down there. So I wasn't exposed to too much stuff until a little older. And then in the summer breaks and winter breaks, I'd come back to the States where we'd stay with my grandparents in Northern Virginia. So it was kind of a fun back and forth, but it definitely showed me two different sides of kind of what humanity is. Because in the basically communist Venezuela, even though they don't claim to be, there is definitely no middle class. It was the upper class and lower class, and it was on display everywhere. Like I said, I was very privileged down there. My family raised racing horses. They bribed the government, like that kind of privilege. But if you would drive anywhere at all, you would just see these pueblos just run down, people on the streets, breaths away from, death and just kind of everything there. So as I got older, I started really realizing what, poverty was and what just kind of, how a lot of people live with that. And then coming to the States, it was a different kind of privilege. We lived near, the DC area where a lot of political people are and everything like that. And in a school district where most of the politicians send their kids. So it's very well taken care of. It's, it was regarded one of the top 5 school districts in the US. So again, education, it was very different. But the money difference there, I grew up more lower middle class in
the US,
in Virginia, in the US.
Yeah.
So it was very interesting kind of getting both sides of it. And at the same time being an outcast in both, because when I was in Venezuela, they latched on to my whiteness. So I was El Gringo. And I wasn't necessarily ostracized for that. A lot of people just saw it as privilege because I was part white. But then in the US, everybody latched on to my Latin side.
Yeah.
And it's where I would get bullied. It's where I would get, all these different things. So having this kind of duality in my childhood, I think really that's what I really pulled from living in these two different places. I think anyone now, especially as, people get older, you can see just how different various places in the world are, even in the US. I'm sure in Ireland as well, you go, the difference from a city to just a very rural area. You see the differences in ideology, the differences in just education or health, and how people take care of each other. So I think what it did more so is it made me aware of the world and just that it's not black and white, it's all gray. And I try to bring a lot of that into the stories I write.
Yeah. It's funny you say about like the differences between where people are raised, really. Like I and actually I'll say this formally as part of the episode. I want to thank you as well for being so gracious to move the recording of the episode, as my grandmother had passed away. But even that, like, I mean, I live and work in the biggest city on the island, in Dublin. And you gone? You're back.
No, I'm here. Sorry. I was adjusting the brightness.
That's okay. I was just like, oh no.
Oh, I didn't realize it like got rid of it.
Yeah,
I could still hear you.
Name, and I was like, oh,
that's funny. Now I'm here.
Anyway, as I was saying, like you know, we deal with death very differently in rural Ireland. We really, really do. I mean, the remains of the person stay in the house longer than they stay anywhere else. And you know, like my grandmother died on Monday, and she was buried. She died Monday at like 2:15, and she was buried Wednesday by 2:00. Like it's really fast in Ireland in general. But I work with a lot of people in the city, and there it's the idea of having the wake or viewing the body in a house instead of in a morgue is really strange to them. And I remember a coworker even a family member passed away, and another coworker was really anxious because they had it in the house instead of having it in a funeral home. And he actually asked me to go with him specifically because I had done this before. I was just like, we've done this before. This is normal. This is how we do it normally.
Yeah, that's funny.
So like, did you see any big, I know that's one country and rural and urban, but did you see was there any really big difference that kind of shocked you? Like, I mean, you kind of mentioned the class system and the kind of differences of poverty and stuff. Was there any really one big thing that kind of made you go, wow, why is that so different here instead of there?
Yeah, actually. And I mean, there's a lot of differences. One, religion. Venezuela is a very Catholic country, so everyone there, you know, attends church regularly, does all these things. I am not a religious person at all. You know, so as a child, I was kind of indoctrinated. What's that? Despite the book title, but the book title is kind of a play on that. It's you know, I was indoctrinated a little bit when I was a kid, but not in the sense that a lot of people were. You know, my family, even just growing up, my immediate family weren't very religious. My grandparents were, my aunts were on my dad's side. Moving to the States, my grandparents there were kind of in the Baptist side of things. But same thing, didn't really go to church, so I wasn't too much there. But there is a difference in kind of just the religion there. But I think the biggest difference that I could really place is just race. Venezuela is a very racist country. And it's, you know, especially towards, you know, Black people, really, they're just very, very racist. And I recall now, you know, so much of what my grandparents would say and how they would act and everything like that to really anyone who was not a white Latin person. So even a lot of the darker Latin, more indigenous kind of Latin Venezuelans there was a lot of racism there. And as a kid, you know, you're not really aware of what these comments necessarily mean or anything like that. Then moving to the States, the high school I went to was written up in the Library of Congress, which is kind of a national, held in Washington, D.C. It's kind of a record of sort. And we actually had at the time Hillary Clinton, who was first lady at the time, come and speak at our school. We had all these things because our school was the most diverse in the country. I think there was something along the lines of 170 different countries represented at my high school.
Right.
It, you know, so being there and seeing just kind of the diversity. Now, there was still a lot of prejudice there as well. A lot of it having to do with high school cliques, but, you know, or different social kind of levels, but the diversity was great to see. And just being exposed to people who were open about just a nice melting pot of people. And then when I went to college at Virginia Tech, Southwest Virginia, within 2 hours, I would see the Confederate flag flying in the back of trucks. I would meet people who had never met a Black person in their life until they got to college. And this is a college where it is predominantly white. So it was very rare to just see anyone who wasn't, Caucasian, I guess. So I would say really the race kind of difference threw me off, or just the ideology towards different races really kind of changed. And when I finally made the move to LA, that's when I finally kind of got exposed to, okay, I'm around people who actually believe everyone is truly equal, and really kind of feel that. So and I think it's something that kind of hit home a little bit too, because even though I mentioned before, when I moved to the States, that's when I would get kind of bullied for my race, or my half race, I guess. But that would happen, yet I would still be around many more people, who were just, it wasn't everyone. It was just like the people who stood out in that kind of bullying nature really stood out, as opposed to just everyone doing it, like in South America. So
it's interesting because you kind of you speak about the racism. It kind of seems like you were on I don't want to say you were on both sides of it, but you saw it from the slightly more privileged race to a race that was slightly less privileged, and it's that kind of must have been a real head spin as a kid.
I dismiss a lot about when I was a kid, because I realized that I was naive. I was very influenced by my surroundings. One of my best friends, was a very privileged, white person, I guess, and this is in Northern Virginia. And but came from a family who was slightly prejudiced and everything like that. And I remember, he's still a really close friend of mine. We have a lot of history and everything like that, keeps us close. Guy with a great heart. But it was interesting learning later in life. And this is kind of where I started realizing as I was getting older that a lot of the bullying that I had when I was a kid that, happened on me, what was behind it. At first I thought I was just small and it was being picked on for that, or that it just happened to everyone. But then as I realized, certain situations and recalled certain situations, it was one of those things where it's like, and just talking to my two best childhood friends and hearing them say that, because my actual last name is Garcia. And hearing them say that they thought that my mom was kind of this like, stereotypical small, darker cleaning lady before they even met her, was just kind of like, well, that's, okay, considering her roots are O'Neill. We're all Irish on that side. Like literally that side of the family, I'd have people think that I was an immigrant coming to the US, maybe even been there illegally. And I learned my genealogy, and I would tell them, actually, my family has been in the US since the mid 1500s. So I've been here, the O'Neills settled in North Carolina in the mid 1500s. So, I've been here longer than you, So it's interesting looking back at a lot of those things and seeing later on how those things influence you as an adult. And I tackle race in a lot of what I write, but without calling it out or making it about racism. I try to just create things that are normal situations within race, whether it's just writing an interracial couple, but not making the story about that. That's just who they are. Because I feel it should be projected and written as normal. Don't make it that that's the whole thing that the story is about. So
it's kind of a thing of like thinking about it, as society progresses, they realize that at first there's visibility, and then there's representation, and then I've heard some people call it normalization, and I've heard of other people calling it usualization. So like like I'm even thinking from my own perspective of being someone that's in the LGBT plus community, there is no gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgender people on television ever when I was a young kid. And
Right.
then when there was, it'd be a big thing. Like I remember
Yep.
there was only like two main soap operas created here in Ireland when I was a kid. One was called Glenroe, which was set in rural Ireland, and one was Fair City, which was in Dublin. So, they kind of covered the whole spectrum. And there was a huge thing. It hit like national headlines when one character had a same-sex kiss on screen
Oh,
in
wow.
the mid-90s, and it was a huge thing. Now it's, then it became a thing of, well, we should have one of the main characters be LGBT or be an interracial couple or something, and that's kind of the big reason they're there. Whereas nowadays it's all about utilization, making something usual and normal. It's just that, yeah, there's a gay character, but that is like they're not a gay character, they're a character that's gay. It's not an interracial,
Right.
it's a couple that happen to be interracial. So it's all about this kind of gradual making things more normal and expected, as opposed to, hey, look at me, I'm being great and progressive.
Yeah. Well, that's what's interesting about that, and is that really stories are what start creating the norm. And nowadays that's in TV and film. When people start kind of seeing it in front of them, it normalizes it for those who were maybe against it.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that, I mean, it's amazing how many people, for example, I'm trying to think of what the show was. Um, yeah, it'll come to me. But there was a show in the U.S. where, and I'm sure at this point it's been all over the place, where one of the main characters was gay, but they didn't make it too crazy. Well, Will and Grace. Will and Grace is actually a great example of that. Where I would meet so many people who were against, for example, gay marriage, but they love that show. Yeah. And it was just such a weird juxtaposition. But the more that they witnessed, kind of the humanity, as to put it, I guess, of that, the more it normalized for them, like you said, normalized, and then it just became something natural. And I remember in California, I think it was in 2008 or so, there was the first vote to legalize gay marriage in California.
Remember that Proposition 8, wasn't it?
Proposition 8, yeah, or H, one of those. And it didn't pass.
Yeah.
The first time. And everyone was kind of blown away. Like, what are you talking about? This is one of the most progressive states, and those sort of things. And I remember telling a lot of my friends who are in the LGBT plus community, it's just like, you have to give it time. It's like the progression of, the same-sex marriages and everything like that has been a lot faster than a lot of the other kind of progressions that have happened in the past. And it should have never been to that point. It should have always just been, anyone can do whatever. But you have to give it time. You have to give people time to be aware and exposed and just understand, this is the first step. And I was telling them, was like, just because this didn't pass doesn't mean it won't pass a couple years from now. And and it has. And it's still, there's a lot of work, still a lot of those things to go with that. I try to advocate for as many different causes as I can with all of that, just being exposed and
prejudice and stuff like that. Because there's so many forms, and it can be really hard and overwhelming a bit sometimes, I think, to be a champion for every cause, especially because you kind of, as you educate yourself, and I'm speaking more for myself obviously, but I'm sure there's other people listening that will kind of identify with this. As you educate yourself on all these things, within racism and transphobia and sexism and all these things, I'm very aware that I'm white cisgendered male, and you're kind of like, okay, so I have to do what I can and raise up kind of awareness and the voices of others, but at the same time not speak for others, and it can be really difficult. And I suppose the thing is, as long as people are trying to do what's right for others, that's all you can hope for.
I agree. I mean, I constantly check my privilege. I realize that any of the smaller kind of prejudices that I've ever had against me pale in comparison to what so many other people have gone through. I try to learn, I try to understand more, so I try to listen, to just anyone that I can to gain more and see how I can help, see how I can do. I know that me walking in the streets last summer during the BLM protests, all that I was able to do there was just show, feet in the streets, show support. There's nothing I can do. I'm not going to be someone who will grab a bullhorn and scream and do all that stuff, because it's not my place.
Yeah.
It's my place to allow and give a safe space to those who can do that. So that's typically the approach I always try to do. And I've had a lot of, like I said, a lot of friends who I've seen oppressed before me. I've stood in front and, kind of stood next to people as they've been doing that, to lend support or to just, be there for them. Because, the world is better when the world is diverse.
Yeah, most definitely.
So, yeah.
We just went down a road I didn't think we would. That's the whole point of this show.
Exactly. Yeah.
Ask questions and we see where we go.
Yeah.
So let's go back a little bit more to you and your personal story. So I know you said I can't remember, was it on one of your TikToks or something, but you said you kind of were always putting pen to paper. So what were the kind of earliest things you started creating, whether it was when you were younger in Venezuela or as you were older? Like what was the first kind of things you started creating story-wise?
Well, let's see. I didn't really do a whole lot of writing in Venezuela. I moved from there to the States permanently when I was 10. So, so I wasn't there too long. It wasn't until I traveled back that I really started, kind of seeing that country for what it was. But I guess the earliest thing I can remember, and it's only because I stumbled across it a few months back, was I think it was in 5th grade or 6th grade out here. So I was maybe 11 or 12. So a year or so afterwards, just a project for English class, which was do creative writing, write these little stories. And it was actually my first book because we bound it and laminated it. And it was, I think there was like 8 short stories in it. And, it was great kind of coming across that and going, wow, okay, this started a lot sooner than I actually thought. I didn't really think that I had started getting into the creative writing space until I was in high school.
So had you forgotten about that book and then found it again, or
completely forgotten? Because it was great, and going back and reading them and actually reading them and going, these weren't that bad. For an 11-year-old, these weren't that bad. The story of how, the detective story of finding my sister's lost Barbie wasn't bad. It's like it was interesting kind of going back and reading that. But then in high school is probably where it really started taking off. More so that's when everyone's emotions seem heightened more than they should be.
Yep.
So the crushes and all those sort of things, I expressed my wants and needs by writing poetry and just creative poetry. And my best friend, who we've been friends forever, he was also writing poetry. And then we got to a point where we would write poetry to each other as conversation about what was going on. And it was interesting. He would write this poem to me about this girl that he, had eyes for, and he didn't know what to do. And I would respond in poem form my advice. It was very interesting. And then another friend of mine, the one I had spoken of earlier, he and I created our own written language.
Oh, wow.
Where we created substitutes for every letter of the alphabet, but then also created a couple symbols for sounds like the TH sound, CH sound, those sort of things, to kind of make it harder for anyone to decipher it. And I think that in itself just became creative writing, even though same thing, we would write about what we're thinking, who we liked, and all of that. Just that idea of doing that. And the funny thing is, from time to time, I try to write that alphabet down again to see if I remember. it's amazing the things you hold on to.
Yeah.
So
I know
so yeah,
a friend of mine taught me a language that it was a spoken constructed language, and basically it's very simple, but basically it's like you put an extra syllable into a syllable on its own. So like,
oh, interesting.
so my name Connor would become Kivagon Nivagur. And we got so used to speaking like that, we actually were able to talk ridiculously fast.
Wow.
Earlier this school year, so I think it might have been October, or maybe it was last school year. I can't remember. Recently enough, there was a particular kid who got really upset and came up to me on the schoolyard and was like, Connor, because the kids called us by our first names. It's like, Connor, such and such of my friends are bullying me. I was like, oh no, well let's go check this out, investigate it. And it turned out that they were talking in the same language that my friend had taught me when we
No
were.
kidding.
And the child that came up to me was like, oh, they're talking about me behind my back because I don't understand what they're saying. And I just came up and it just straight away, I just started speaking to them in that language. Being like, guys, what are you doing? That's not fair. If you're going to talk, I was like, if you're going to and I said, you need to teach your friends. And the two kids are just like,
that's great.
but yeah, I know, like you do have these like things you create with your friends sometimes as a kind of
yeah
secret code or something. And I love these bromance poems you were sending to your friend as well.
You know, it was weird, and I still have those. I've kept, you know, so many of those. I actually I put a lot of mine into the very first book I ever published through Amazon was a collection of poetry.
That's right.
And it was poetry that I'd written from basically the end of middle school all through college. And there's some dark things there. There's some, you know, things where just kind of the, you know, I like that girl and the obsessive kind of things that most people in, you know, kind of their youths have over unobtainable, you know, people, that sort of thing. And then random ones. I wrote a poem in there about the Jolly Green Giant. You know, yeah, really weird stuff. But that was the first thing I had published, and I still have plans to go back and just reformat it, make it look nicer. But part of me wants to keep it that way as how it is, as just a reminder that that was the first.
Yeah.
So I'm torn between that, but yeah, no, the poetry stuff continued. And then in college, I took 2 classes in the same semester that actually kind of, I feel, set me on my path to writing professionally. Okay. I took a creative writing class, which the teacher was just fantastic. Ironically, these are the only 2 classes I got an A in, or I got high marks in college. I was not the best student then. I learned more through National Geographic on TV than I did going to classes. Part of that was because I just didn't know what I wanted to do yet. Yeah. So creative writing, great teacher, really encouraging. And it was very therapeutic because just, you know, a certain darkness that I had in my head, I was able to put down to paper and write these things, and saw directly how it would affect people when they read it. So that became kind of a drug, so to speak, of just like, oh wow, I can affect people this way. This is cool. Like, you know, this is a great way to do it. And at the same time, I took a geography class, which is not what you would expect. The teacher was basically Bill Nye, but for geography.
Okay.
The coolest teacher ever. And the way he would teach it, it was, you know, an introduction to that geography is not just about where things are. It's about the people who are there, the weather and all that stuff. I'm like, oh, well, yeah, that makes sense, but never thought of it that way. But what he would do is every week he would assign us a new region in the world. And we had to write a 1-page paper after watching a film and write about how accurate the geography in the film was to the region.
So if you had Ireland, you would watch a film set in Ireland and then correct the geography of the film, for example.
Exactly. I'm trying to think if I don't recall where I
no,
watched some of. No, I'm trying to think because some of them were very obscure indie films, which were great. Like for Australia, I watched Walkabout. For South Africa, I watched Endless Summer. For the US, and specifically the West Coast US, I watched Boys in the Hood for LA.
Okay.
So it didn't matter what film you watched as long as it was of the region and you could write something. And that's where my love for visual storytelling came from, for film and TV, and the want to do screenwriting and stuff was from a geography class. So taking those two at the same time, it actually, introduced me to this whole idea of storytelling. And that summer, I went to Los Angeles to take 2 classes at UCLA. One was a directing class and one was a screenwriting class. And during that screenwriting class, that's when I knew that I wanted to tell stories for a living.
Yeah.
That was the confirmation.
So we'd say from early childhood, or not from early childhood, but you're writing poetry, you're writing just fun things, you're just being really creative and expressive. And then college, you get to geography, and there's this film thing that you have to do every week, and it gets you into movies and visual storytelling. And then you take this random class in UCLA.
Yep.
Really, you're like, yeah, this is what I want.
Exactly.
So how did you then get from finishing that one class during the summer in UCLA to working in television writing?
Well, as soon as I graduated college, and I was thinking of transferring to UCLA while I was in college, but I was going to lose some time. I just wanted to finish. I probably shouldn't have. I should have just left and given myself 2 extra years start. But I went back. I finished school, and within 2 weeks of graduating college, I moved to LA. I was fortunate in that my uncle had been out here since the 70s. And I had convinced my mom and sister to move out the summer prior to when I had taken those classes at UCLA. My mom was going into business with my uncle. I was like, move out there. My sister is an incredible singer, great voice, go. This is a place for her. Yeah. So I had people here. I had a support system here. So I didn't just come out here blindly. Came out though. What's that?
I said that really helps though, having that.
Yes, absolutely. Especially because what I first tried to do was acting.
Okay.
So came out here to do acting, had early success with that. A piece of my life that I always preface with this because it's embarrassing, but I know I shouldn't be. I did runway modeling for about 4 years as well. Which paid some of the bills and everything like that. It's exactly what you would think when you look at Zoolander.
Oh, yeah, there he is. Gone. Well, folks, this is the background of what happens. Oh well. So we are back after after I'm not saying these things are related, but there's fires and there was overheating, and let's just leave it there, and the listeners can see what actually. You had just said that being a runway model was just like Zoolander. So how well do you know Owen Wilson?
It would be great to know. It's funny. LA is a small town. It's a big city. It's a small town in that everyone has, the whole 6 degrees of separation that they say with Kevin Bacon. In LA, if you live here, you're at least 2 or 3 people away from someone. So my girlfriend's former boss is best friends with Owen Wilson. So there you go. So runway modeling was interesting, and it was kind of a side of Hollywood I did not want to be a part of. Even as much as it is like Zoolander with just kind of the idiocy and all of that stuff, it is also ripe with predators. And I did not want to be part of that. I was prey. And that was not me. That was just kind of a world I didn't want to pursue. So I ended up taking another screenwriting class in LA. And that one was actually a great class. I met some of my closest friends in LA there. And that's where I really dug deep and wrote my first screenplay. That one being a Wizard of Oz type of tale, but using Salvador Dali imagery.
Oh, cool.
So it's great. And that one's gotten some attention here and there. It's won a few contests and things like that. But at that point, I just kept writing with LA and just kind of the film and TV industry. You learn that you don't just rest on one story. You have to write, because even if your first story is the best, it might not be the one that gets the people's attention first. Yeah. So I wrote, and had this idea for a kind of a heist film that I actually wrote the entire screenplay in 10 days. It was just one of those things where I was possessed. Wrote it down, and it ended up being kind of a Pulp Fiction, Usual Suspects type of thing with like kind of twists and turns and everything. And that's the one that ultimately got me a job on a TV show. So I hadn't even really written TV at that point. I'd only really written films, but I, at the time, was working as a golf instructor for kids. And one of the clients that I had, his father, was a TV writer. And he had created the show with another showrunner. It had been on for a couple of years already, and they were looking for new writers. So he asked to read one of my scripts. I sent him that one called LA Legend. He read it. They brought me in for an interviewed, and I got the job. And it was fantastic. And, an intro to a completely different world. Started as a writing assistant there, but in the TV writing world, that's kind of how you have to get it to step up and move up. It's one of the few areas in the Hollywood industry where there's actually kind of like a progression.
Yeah.
As opposed to just, hey, here's some money, you're lucky, that lottery kind of feel. Started working on the show Leverage right there, and was introduced to TV and the good side of it. I was in probably a room filled with some of the best showrunners and writers. Whereas a lot of other TV shows, you hear stories of them working for 14 hours, not being able to see their families, screaming matches, like all these crazy things that happen in the writing rooms, TVs, for TV shows, that a lot of people don't know about. But the one I was in, our showrunner was, I would say he was a mix between Cumberbatch's Sherlock and Freeman's Watson. He really was a mix, because he had Sherlock's mind, but like Watson's demeanor.
Okay. It'd be worse if it was the other way around.
yes, it would. So it really worked, and he ran a show perfectly. And I actually saw him at one point use his memory palace, and I had never seen anyone actually do that. So that was impressive. But it really introduced me to a lot, and that's when I was given the opportunity to write for the show. So wrote an episode, and unfortunately we were ceremoniously canceled after 5 seasons.
As happens.
As it happens. And even though, now nearly 10 years later, they revived it with some of the same cast, and it's coming out again and all that stuff. So, but it's a very different world. It's very different than writing books. That is for sure.
And that's what I was going to ask, because I'm aware, because there was a show that finished maybe 2-3 years ago now, The Good Place on NBC, a sitcom.
Yeah,
and
it's great.
I was obsessed. And there was because it's really interesting, there was a podcast done by I can't remember the actor's name now, but the guy who plays Sean in The Good Place, and he's also in Brooklyn Nine-Nine. And he was the host of the podcast. And what he did was he went through the whole show again, episode by episode, but brought in like an actor or a costume designer or a screenwriter or whatever. So I've always known that with TV writing, it starts with a load of people in a room, and they kind of come up with the basic structure, and then they give the basic structure to somebody and say, right, now go actually write it so that the actors have lines to memorize.
Yes, yeah.
So it must have been really weird then to go from that kind of really collaborative and supportive, from what you're telling me, atmosphere, to then go and start writing Genesis and be totally on your own.
It is different. Let me do a quick aside, just because you brought up Sean, talking about how small LA is. My niece is best friends with I don't know how he relates to her family, but I sat next to him this is pre-COVID, during their winter play, which was Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, where the person he was there to see played Charlie and I was there to see play Violet. And they're best friends. So really funny. We shared a couple pleasantries, seemed like a nice guy. I tried not to bring up Good Place because I do love that show. My girlfriend's obsessed with that show. So I had to kind of calm her down and say, but I thought you'd like that, just because out of all the people to bring him up.
That would be me. If I was there, I'd be like, with your graphic card, let's go talk to him. Oh my God.
Yeah. But yeah, it seemed like a really nice guy. So as far as the difference between TV and film, or not TV and film, TV, film, and then writing books, I've always said that writing a book is like rowing a canoe from New York to Europe, basically. You are doing it by yourself. You are traversing all this crazy water by yourself. You have to do it, and you just have to persevere. You have to just do it on your own. With TV, it's, you're on a yacht, basically, with everyone doing their own thing. But if it breaks down, there are people there who will fix it. If there's so much money already thrown at it to make sure that, at least try to make sure it doesn't fail. So that's kind of one of those things where, there is a difference there, as far as what it feels like. As far as the writing itself, what I've always said is that when you write books, you use all your senses and you write all the senses. So you write sight, sound, smell, touch, taste, because you're trying to convey to the reader different things. So if, the character's eating something, you might describe the taste in what you're writing. When you're writing for film and TV, you only do sight and sound.
Okay.
Because
and by sound, isn't it?
Exactly. So, and by sound, I mean mostly like dialogue, or if there's a bang or something like that, just because the actors will take care of the taste. They'll take care of the emotional sense. They'll take care of all those other things. The director takes care of another, part of it. And because it's collaborative, you don't have to include how a character feels. You write it in the dialogue. And the actor comes in and interprets that dialogue and then says, this is how I feel. This is how I convey my anger. If you try to tell the actor how to be angry, chances are you're not going to be a very popular writer. So, you leave it up to the actor to do that. You leave it up to, lots of times, to the director to even, set up what the house looks like. So very rarely do you go into detail as to, how a house is laid out, where the tables and couches are, unless it's vital to, the actual scene. You leave that blank, and that's the set deck and the director's, job to put those things there. Or, going into detail over like what the bang sounds like. Does it sound like a hammer hitting metal, or does it sound like a firecracker? Those are things that we would put in a book, but in TV and film, you don't put those things. So it's interesting doing that. And for me, I like the difference because I like being able to add some of those details into the books that I write. But what's interesting is a lot of people, when they read my books, especially my novels, they tend to say that it has a very cinematic feel to it. And I think it's because of my initial background coming from the film and TV side of things. I tend to do that.
Set things up that way. And that's probably how you think as well.
Yeah, it is. And, I like to think that I'm collaborating with the reader when I write. So lots of times I don't go into a whole lot of detail with, how some people look or how certain things will look. Because I like the idea when I read, I like what I come up with in my head, what someone might look like. When So that's kind of what I want the reader to do. There might be some distinct features here and there, but I try not to really guide them in one direction or another as to how someone looks or anything like that. I'll give them identifying features, but I won't really go into a whole lot of detail with how they look or anything like that. I don't know. To me, it's just, and I think a lot of that comes from the whole idea of, I think Hunger Games, and it's happened before, where there was one character in the book, was written a certain way and portrayed as a certain race, I think it is. And when they cast the film, that character looked different. And then, people kind of threw up their arms and said, this is not how this person was written or how any of that. And, I think this goes back to my whole idea of like the inclusivity and trying to just, let anyone decide like this is what this person looks like because that's how I relate to the story. So, and these books are written in first person too, so it kind of it lends
there,
to,
isn't it? Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
Did you ever feel as well, because like writing for, especially because you joined Leverage, like you weren't there from season one, like you joined it sometime later, like because to me I'd feel a bit not constricted, but with TV there's set boundaries and the characters are already formed and there's only
Yes.
types of stories you can tell. And I mean, yeah, you could change the way a character might behave in a certain episode, but there's only so much you can drastically change something. Or you can't just come in and say,
Right.
well, my episode, I'm going to kill off the main character,
Right.
So did you ever find that, especially now compared to Genesis, did you ever find that kind of those, I don't want to say limitations, let's say those rules. Oh, what's the difference? Limitation rule. But did you ever find that frustrating at all, that you couldn't write what you wanted to write?
Not really, because it's a different type of exercise. You're not told right before you write it those are the rules you have to do. You go into it knowing those rules.
Yeah.
So you're prepared to do that, and it actually ends up being kind of fun because it's a different way to exercise your writing and your creativity, in that you go, okay, can I write in the voice that was already created for this character? Do I have that skill set to be able to do that, so that when someone reads it, I'm not changing the character? They go, oh, this was written by the same person. And this is also where it's very important that you leave things up to the actors, because as a writer in TV, unless you are the showrunner and show creator, the actor knows more about their character than the writer does, because they have lived that character, they have been that character. So you have to kind of collaborate with them and oftentimes take notes from the actors as to what to write, because they will say, my character wouldn't say this, or they wouldn't say this way. And you kind of have to step back and say, okay, well, what is that they would say it, so I can write that in there. So that helps, that kind of creativity. But yeah, I look at it as, you're sitting there on the treadmill all the time, when you're writing something and you want to mix it up, but you're still exercising, you get on the elliptical. It's a different exercise, but it's still benefiting. And it's helped. I find it as a fun challenge. I've met other writers who don't like that. They like having complete control over that. But it's fun. I mean, TV is nothing more than fan fiction. Really. You have one person who writes a pilot episode, everything else is fan fiction. So that's kind of a way to see it. And ironically, a lot of people in TV have written a lot of fan fiction, or more so, they come from a Dungeons and Dragons background, which is really interesting because of the building the story and working on story together.
Yeah, yeah. I am. You wouldn't know this, but I actually did a Dungeons and Dragons episode with.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, for Christmas last year. Guests that had been on the show and guests that were about to be on the show, and we did a little D&D session because Dungeons and Dragons is very like there are there's a lot of storytelling in it. We're gonna start wrapping up soon, but not yet. So I'd just like to know, could you tell me a little bit, like I know a little bit about it, but could you tell our listeners and watchers a bit about Genesis and where the idea came from? What was the genesis of Genesis?
The genesis of Genesis. Ironically, from my Spotify playlist. And a Flaming Lips song came on, followed by a Talking Head song that came on. And the Talking Head song was Nothing But Flowers. The Flaming Lips song was one that for some reason I never remembered the name of. I always confused it with something else. But the lyrics start with Unit 3021, something like that, which for some reason in my head just kind of went like, what? Interesting. 3021. What would the year be like? Like, what's Earth going to be like there at that point? You know, what are humans doing? And then the Nothing But Flowers song from Talking Heads is all about a restart of basically Earth. People who were aware, you know, say for example, we are here, we are aware of what's going on in our lives. If all of a sudden everything went back to how it was in, you know, quote unquote, the Garden of Eden, but we still had knowledge of chocolate chip cookies, of cars, of all those things, we would miss all of those things. You know, we constantly crave these things of like, we want peace, we want the Garden of Eden again, or something along those lines, you know, but we take what we have for granted. So put this idea in my head of what would lead to the world having to be reset. So I just started kind of going through that and really started playing. The first thing that popped into my mind was I've read the Bible, and the book of Genesis, the very first thing says, in the beginning, God created, you know, the heavens and the earth.
Yeah.
You know, and it goes into he created man. And for some reason in my head, what popped in was, in the beginning, man created God, which that comes from my kind of non-religious, you know, that sort of thing. Another song by the band XTC. There's a song that's called Dear God that goes into it. And there's a lyric in there that says, did you make mankind after we made you? So it's kind of a lot of it's music really drove the story in this to start with. So I started thinking about like, okay, well, what if I rewrote the book of Genesis in a sense? And then Genesis came to mind. I was like, okay, well, that's kind of, I can split it apart and make it stand for genetic systems.
Yeah.
Genetic systems being these humans that were created in the center for genetic and obstetric design, or the Center for God.
Okay.
And the first two created were Adam, ATOM, after, you know, the Adam, and Eve, EV, short for evolution. So who were these scientists that created them? Why did they create them? And my thought was just, well, humans are on a path to self-destruction. War, famine, you know, just ego, and you know, just the idea of isolating ourselves from everyone else in the world as opposed to working together, that's going to lead to the downfall. So I was like, okay, if there's a downfall, what would the smartest scientists decide to do? They would probably want to restart it. Mm-hmm. So that's where this came from, is that humans are on the brink of extinction, and these scientists have gotten together and decided, you know what, our best hope for humans to survive is if we started over with better humans that we create in this lab. Okay. So that's who Adam and Eve are, and the 10 other Genesis, whose names are all short for the 10 most abundant elements on Earth. And the problem comes when Adam becomes aware of all the suffering happening outside of the compound. So this is kind of where Buddhism comes in a little bit. He becomes aware of the suffering and realizes that in order for the restart to happen, all of the outsiders, all of the people living outside these compound walls will die. You know, the scientists plan on setting off a nuclear apocalypse to restart it. You know, you can't restart it without ending the previous thing.
Yes.
So he struggles with this back and forth, and should he stop it? Shouldn't he stop it? The moral dilemma of those. And he, along the way, befriends a drone, this military clone that's been created to protect them, saves his life, and he befriends this drone, who, I'll get to a story about that real quick, who starts changing his mind going through there. The drone named 80 is what the sequel is about.
Okay, very good. Yeah.
Okay. And here's a fun little fact. So when I started writing Genesis, I was on Twitter. After the first 5 chapters, I kind of found some beta readers because I wanted to see what they thought. You know, before I kept going, I wanted to get some ideas. And overwhelmingly, they all loved this character 80,
Okay.
which is the name of the drone.
Yeah.
And I had originally planned on killing him off. But because there was so much just love for this character, I had to kind of rewrite my thoughts on this, you know, what I was going to do. So I didn't kill him off. I let it happen. And ultimately, the second book is so he gets sent away in the middle of this first book. The second book starts off right when he gets sent away. So it's not a true sequel. It's almost like 1.5.
Yeah.
In a sense. This drone leads the revolution against the scientists. So it kind of all culminates in the same place, and this Genesis and book 280 both end at the same time. So
yeah, because there's I think before we were recording, I mentioned a book series called Bobiverse, and I had the author Dennis Taylor was on in a previous episode, and he kind of did the same thing ish, where one character, I'm not going to, because it's immensely complex, but basically one character jets off in a random direction exploring and never returns, and the fourth book, which is 16 hours long to listen to, is the exploration looking for him, looking for what went and what happened, and then finding this strange place and all that kind of thing. So yeah, it's kind of, I know what you mean. It's not exactly a sequel, but it's a kind of a
it's
while cool.
exactly. But you know, realizing how it's still important to what continues. I mean, I have at least two more books planned in this series, which are true sequels to the original.
And I'm sure that the everyone listening and watching are going to be like, oh God, where can I get these books? So why don't you tell us where people find you and your books and all that kind of stuff online?
Yeah, so you can find me on all my socials at Aaron Denius. So TikTok, Instagram, Twitter. I don't really do Facebook, but all the others are there, and I'm active in all of them. As far as the book, you can find them in different places, Barnes and Nobles and such, but I prefer to push Amazon forward, mainly because I like their analytics. So you can find all of them on Amazon. Those, as well as other books that I've written.
And stuff. And as always, for anyone listening and watching, they'll all be in the description, and there'll be links and all that kind of a thing. So my final question then, it's the same question I ask everybody at the end. What was the last book you read?
The last book I read is a book that I read every single year, and that's A Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I always go back to that book. I feel it's a must read for any writer. One of my top 5 must reads for any writer. And it's just, I don't know, the humor and the philosophy in it is just, it always gets me excited. It gets me happy and wanting to continue my writing journey.
Brilliant. Aaron, Denius, thank you so much for coming on to the show. And as I said earlier, for being so accommodating as well and changing the date. So yes, thanks very much. Learned loads, and what's annoying is there's so much more I wanted to ask you, but you know, I'll have to get you on another time or something.
Absolutely. I really appreciate it, Connor. It's been great.